It was 2008, and I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell my parents, my family. I didn't tell my coworkers. I didn't tell my best friend, or any of my friends for that matter. I just knew I had a problem with alcohol. If I could have thought myself out of it, I would have. Because my PhD is actually in pharmacology. I know a lot about how the body works. But this really had me by the ear. And so, without telling anyone, I checked myself in to an outpatient program in Houston. And the shame was really overwhelming because I had to come to the point to admit that I actually had a problem. This meant I had a mental illness, according to my textbook. And in my family, mental illness was not looked upon as something that was very good. It was usually considered something that was a weakness or something basically to be ashamed of. Maybe it's just that you don't have good self-control, or maybe that you're just not very moral. And so it was really brutal for me to come to that internal realization. And I'm not even sure I really could fully embrace it. You know, when I went through rehab at about week 3, they finally wore me down to where I could tell my parents. And then I wished I hadn't several times. But, you know, the shame was really, really still overwhelming through the whole process. And when I got out, I had learned some things. I had learned what it was like to be on the inside of an alcoholic brain, one that was an addict. I had learned how to kind of arrange my environment and my life to be able to live a life where I wasn't, or I didn't feel like I was careening towards death, which was really what it felt like in my soul before. Really great suffering. But the shame was really still central in my life. And so I wasn't really interested in being sober. I was interested in not having an illness. And so I very carefully, after about 8 months of sobriety, went back to trying to drink like a normal person. And this can work for some people. I personally believe that substance use disorder is a spectrum disorder. Some people have a little bit of it, some people have a lot. Kills some people really quickly. But I kind of tried to ignore the fact that I'd even been to rehab. Nobody really needed to know. I'm just going to continue, and I'm just going to have a couple drinks. I'm going to want to go out with my coworkers. And I did. And I did that for about 4 years. The only problem was the central part of that story was shame. Every time that I drank, I wanted another drink. And then that made me feel ashamed of what I really was. And every time I drank, it provoked anxiety and depression in me. And then that was like another cycle of shame that I was living in. And so I was really stuck. I was just stuck in shame. And then something really awesome happened to me. You know how when you have like an epiphany and you can remember exactly where you were when something happened to you, all of a sudden your life opens up and your perspective shifts? For me, it was something as simple as I was reading an article, and it was an article about self-compassion. And for me, this was one of those moments. My perspective on life completely changed when I learned about the possibility of self-compassion. I remember exactly where I was sitting. I was sitting on my couch in the living room. I remember exactly what I was reading. It blew my mind, this idea of self-compassion, that you could have, that first of all, you have a relationship with yourself. And then second of all, that relationship could actually be kind and supportive. For me, that was not even on my radar. You know, my mind on the inside was a pretty awful, toxic place. And so when I read this article, my mind was like, wow, wow, you can do that? And then I began to read more, and all of the outcomes of self-compassion were laid out for me. It was work by a woman named Dr. Kristen Neff, who is a professor up at UT Austin. And she created a scale to measure self-compassion and was very interested to know how people that had high levels of self-compassion differed from people who had low levels. And it turns out that people with high levels of self-compassion have far less depression, far less anxiety and negative stress in their lives. They tend to be more productive, more innovative and creative. They have better interpersonal relationships. They have better resilience in the face of tragedy or disappointment or suffering of any kind. And I was just blown away by this because I wanted all of those things. I didn't have those things and I wanted them really badly. And so I was really excited. And one of the things also that the research showed was that if you had higher levels of self-compassion, you're actually better able to make health behavior changes. So positive health behavior changes like quitting smoking, sticking to a healthy diet, sticking to your exercise plan. And so now preliminary research is showing that that substance use disorder is probably going to be included in that as well. And I was excited. My life changed in that instant. I knew what I needed. And at that moment, I asked myself, what would be the most self-compassionate thing that I could do for myself? And I couldn't even finish that thought when quit drinking. The answer was there for me. I had basically been taking alcohol and like grabbing a stick and poking myself in the eye with it, just hurting myself on a regular basis with this substance. And I didn't need to do that anymore. And that just really changed my life. And so, like any good academic, I started studying it. And I pulled down all the research articles and I read through everything that it can do and I studied the scale. And one day I had a second epiphany, maybe a little more embarrassing than the first one. And that was that I was kind of like one of those students who puts their textbook under their pillow and hopes that while they're sleeping, they're going to pull in the information and pass the test. Except for me, I was studying self-compassion like a student and expecting it to change my life. And what I needed to be doing was practicing it. And so I laughed at myself. And then I began really going into wondering or figuring out what is the practice and what does that look like for me? And so practicing self-compassion has three main components. One is mindfulness. Basically, this realization that you have a relationship with yourself and the ability to self-monitor those thoughts in your head. And then also common humanity, which is the recognition that we are one. And so when we're suffering, we recognize that we're not the only ones that are suffering. It's highly likely there's other people that have the exact same problem that we do. And then the third part is practicing that self-kindness. And that self-kindness, that self-compassion is really where I think the heavy lifting is of practice of self-compassion. And so I started taking classes and learning the practices. And I learned that really the practice of self-compassion comes down to treating yourself in the same kind and supportive way that you would treat a friend or a loved one who was suffering. And compassion, the root word compassio, means to suffer. And so compassion is really a response to suffering. And so this idea of how you treat a friend was something that is part of the practice of self-compassion. And so I wanted to just do a little exploratory exercise with you. If you would close your eyes for just a minute. I want you to think back to the last time that you had a friend who was suffering and they came to you for support or for some comfort, what did you say to them? What kind of tone of voice did you use? Did you touch them, hug them? Tell them you have the similar problem? Now, give that friend a hug and let them go in your mind. Now I want you to think back in the recent past to a time that you were suffering. Maybe it was because of a mistake you made or something that you said that might have hurt someone's feelings. What did it sound like in your head? What did you say to yourself? What kind of tone of voice do you use with yourself? What did you do to take care of yourself? And you can open your eyes. We use this little exercise to show the contrast between how we might treat other people versus sometimes a really harsh and critical way that we can treat ourselves when we screw something up. And this exercise really kind of shows that contrast. And in fact, you might recognize kind of the core principle as being really close to the golden rule. You know, you should treat others the way that you treat yourself, right? And the golden rule transcends many religions. It goes through many religions. It's in all three Abrahamic religions. It's in Hinduism, Buddhism, and many more. It's so core to our being that it's probably part of our being. It's part of our oneness, this idea that we want to treat others with kindness, right? But something kind of got lost in translation in our culture these days, it seems like, because we tend to sometimes treat others better than we treat ourselves, which is, exemplified in that exercise we just did. And so practicing self-compassion, we can think about the golden rule and how it is a principle for living. And we can turn that compassion on ourselves and know that it's okay for us to do that. It's not selfish. It's not self-centered. It's something that we need to do. It's part of the golden rule. In fact, if we believe we are one, then our thoughts matter, right? Our thoughts really matter to the one. And so you're not alone in your head thinking those terrible thoughts about yourself. That actually affects the collective. And so it's our responsibility. This is part of our spiritual practice to do this work. And one of the powerful ways that we can do this is by remembering the golden rule. And so one of the take-home messages is that it's a practice and that it's not perfect, right? And so you're never going to get to that point where all of a sudden you're 100% self-compassionate, right? And you don't have to work at it anymore. And it reminds me of a story, actually, when I was like a baby practitioner of self-compassion. And I gave my first presentation on self-compassion, and I know for sure there's at least 2 people, maybe 3 in the room who were there. And I got up at the front with my PowerPoint slides, and I was very excited, and I talked about the science, and I talked about all the outcomes and the research, and I think it went pretty well. And it just so happened my parents were visiting from out of town when that happened. And so they were very good parents. They were sitting in the front row, paying attention, nodding. And so afterwards, we hop in the car and go home. And when I opened the door, I realized that my little dog was sick. And I scooped her up and I showed her compassion. And I thought, I've forgotten to give her her medication. And I said, oh, I'm such a bad dog mom. And my dad turns to me and said, sounds like someone needs to practice a little self-compassion. And I was like, yep, indeed. And apparently I have a little ways to go with my practice. But it's still the case. We're not perfect humans. We're fallible people. And so we're always going to have opportunities to practice self-compassion because there's always going to be times that we suffer. Sometimes it's at our own hand. Sometimes something outside happens to us and we suffer. And so one of the things that we can do to practice self-compassion is to forgive ourselves. Another thing that seems to weave through many, many spiritual traditions is the idea that we need to forgive others. We need to show mercy and grace to others and compassion to others. And we believe that, right? And it makes our lives better if we practice forgiveness of others. You know that you can set down resentments and you can free yourself. Well, practicing self-forgiveness is a critical component of practicing self-compassion. And it's kind of like a get-out-of-jail-free card in many respects. So I think that sometimes people have a hard time with forgiveness because it's easy to recognize that other people screw up and they need forgiveness, right? But sometimes we don't let ourselves off the hook. And I've had people ask me, and they say, like, you don't know what I've done. I don't deserve forgiveness. But that's not true. It is your divine birthright to be forgiven. Spirit forgives you. It's time to get on board and be a part of that forgiveness and practice that self-forgiveness, because when you embody that self-forgiveness, you're free. And it feels amazing and it feels light. And so it was maybe 6 months after I had set my sober date. I thought I was really going to be in for it, white knuckle riot, it's going to be hard. And it turned out it was incredibly easy. I just quit drinking. I quit torturing myself with alcohol. And I'm driving down the road in San Antonio. San Antonio's a party town. And up on the little thing was one of those clever drinking and driving rhymes. And I had the most amazing feeling of freedom that came over me because I said, I never have to worry about that again. And so this process of embodying self-compassion, of embodying self-forgiveness for what I had done to myself all those years, just really took hold, and I felt amazing. And I'm here to share some of that with you. Well, thank you very much.